Welcome, everyone. My name is Peter Wen. I'm the Associate Director for the Yale Center Beijing. And also Yang Liu is also the Associate Director for Communication for Yale Center Beijing. So once again, welcome to the Yale Center Beijing. So Yale Center Beijing is actually a Yale University embassy in China and also an activity center here in China for Yale University, serving its 14 schools. And today, it is our privilege to welcome Professor Luke Sanford here to give you a lecture. And also, Professor Luke Sanford actually arrived in Beijing yesterday. So this is his second day here in Beijing. He's still experiencing a little bit of jet lag, but I think he's ready to go. And just one hint, we just met like an hour before. So Luke Sanford can actually say a pretty fluent Chinese, but he will use English for this lecture. So if you have any questions after the session or you want to ask in Chinese, I think Luke is capable to answer your question or at least hear your question and answer in English. And you can see from the TV, so today we have an online session. The online session is only limited to the program attendees for tomorrow, Luke Sanford's program. So it is not open to general public. So I just want to give you an explanation about the online participant. So, okay, so I will give the microphone to Luke to start the session.
All right. Thank you, Peter. 大家好，晚上好。我叫 Luke Sanford， 我是一个耶鲁大学环境学院的一个副教授。然后今天不好意思，我不能用中文给你讲所有的，因为我的中文不够好。但是我至少可以开始给你们讲一下。So I'm going to switch to English now because unlike you, unlike many of you, I'm not bilingual enough to talk about research in my second language. But like Peter said, I would love to answer any questions that you have or try to understand and answer questions you have in Chinese. So today, I'll be telling you a little bit about nature-based carbon credits and carbon markets. I think it's a topic of increasing importance. Just to demonstrate, like Peter said, I flew over here, arrived yesterday morning, so I'm just waking up right now. Hopefully, I'll get more awake as we go. It's just after 7 a.m. my time. But I flew over here, and often when you take a flight, you have the option of offsetting your flight's emissions using carbon credits. Has anyone ever offset your emissions with carbon credits? Anyone? Okay. We have a couple of people who've done this, which seems like maybe the right thing to do for the world, right? I didn't offset my emissions coming over here. So that's one way that people engage with carbon credits and carbon markets. The second way is there are many firms, companies, that have made net zero commitments, which means they want their emissions in total to be zero by some date. For Shell, it was the year 2050. And you might think, how can a fossil fuel company have zero emissions? It seems like not possible. And so the way that they plan to offset their emissions is by purchasing carbon credits. So the emissions that they're not able to reduce themselves, they will pay someone else to reduce their emissions or to sequester some carbon, to make it so that in total, the emissions that they put out into the atmosphere and then the emissions they pay someone else to reduce or sequester sum to zero. Now, recently, we've seen more headlines that look like this. This is a headline that says Shell scrapped its 100 million carbon offset plan, where they said we're not going to spend $100 million every year on carbon offsets. And then just earlier this week, Shell said they don't think that they're going to be able to be net zero by the year 2050 because they don't think that carbon credits work well enough. And so we'll get into this a little bit, but I'll show you some other headlines to this effect. Credibility threatens forests. Action needed to make carbon offsets conservation work for climate change. Systematic overcrediting in California's forest carbon offsets program, which I'll tell you a little bit about later. Methodological issues with deforestation baselines compromise the integrity of carbon credits. These are a number of research papers published in around the last 5 years by some of my friends and colleagues using remote sensing to quantify the additional climate benefits of California forest carbon offset projects. There's been a lot of academic interest in how well these carbon offsets actually work, or what effects they have on the landscape. And so here we'll switch a little bit away from the buyers of carbon offsets, which could be you, it could be emitting companies like Shell, and focus more on what's going on with the producers of carbon offsets, so the people who are being paid to reduce their emissions. And so, in part, because of all this criticism of carbon offsets that's taken place, now we've seen growth in companies where it's their job to rate carbon credits. So if you want to go and purchase carbon credits on the carbon market, you can now go and look up on several different websites what the rating of different carbon credits is. And these are rated similar to bonds, so they go from like AAA to D based on how high quality they are. And then we have rebuttals from those who are producing carbon credits, saying that previous criticism is off base. But if we look at what's happened in the voluntary carbon market, where most of these credits are bought and sold, we see a gradual trend upward in sales of carbon credits, and then over the last 3 years or so, a huge decrease in the number of credits that are being transacted, bought and sold. And so something is going on here. And maybe the biggest headline of those papers that I showed you was published right at the end of 2022, the beginning of 2023, and maybe caused this market to really shrink. And so there's a lot going on in this world, and I hope that in this talk, I'll be able to take you through part of what's going on in the world of carbon credits, and then I'll share with you some of my recent research in this area. So in today's talk, we'll go through in a little bit more detail what carbon credits are, how they're supposed to work. I'll tell you about baselines and additionality, which are sort of the two fundamental core concepts behind carbon credits. I'll tell you about a program that's gaining a lot of traction right now, which is called Jurisdictional RED+. There are huge commitments in the billions of dollars to Jurisdictional RED+. And now I'll tell you about a slightly different flavor of carbon credits, which are carbon credits in compliance markets. And I'll tell you about some of my research, which uses satellite imagery and machine learning to assess how well these carbon credits actually work. And then I'll wrap up. And hopefully, I'll leave some time for questions at the end. So to get started, I want to go through some of the core terms in the world of carbon credits. The first one is a baseline. And the baseline is an estimate of the carbon emissions or the carbon sequestration that would have happened without some carbon project. So if I pay you to do something, the baseline is what you would have done if I did not pay you. And for these carbon credit projects, often the companies that are selling carbon credits are reducing their deforestation on their land. And the baseline is how much deforestation they would have allowed had someone not paid them to reduce it. Additionality is the difference between that baseline, what someone would have done, and what they did in the world of carbon credits. So those are the changes that are directly attributable to the project. A carbon credit is 1 ton of carbon that is not in the atmosphere because of the project. So 1 carbon credit usually amounts to 1 ton. Now, a couple of other terms that won't be the main focus of this talk, but are important in the world of carbon credits are permanence, which is how long does that carbon stay out of the atmosphere? Right? I could pay you to not emit some carbon right now, but you might go and emit that carbon next year. And that way, in that sense, that reduced emission was not very permanent. And often this is a criticism of nature-based carbon credits, where people say if you pay someone to preserve a forest for 5 years, and then they go cut it down, how much carbon did you really prevent from going into the atmosphere? So more permanence is usually better. Leakage is another, in my opinion, understudied and underappreciated issue with carbon credits, which is if I pay someone to not cut down their forest, how much of that deforestation occurs in nearby places? So if I was going to cut down a forest and plant some crops there, and then someone pays me to not cut down that forest, how much of my neighbors cut down more forests so they can plant the crops that I didn't plant? And if that deforestation is just displaced to somewhere else, it's not much of a net benefit to the atmosphere. And then the last sort of major issue that people are concerned about is double counting, which is, can the same carbon credit be used more than once? And if it can be used more than once, it's not valid the second time that it's used. Because 1 ton of sequestration shouldn't be used to offset more than 1 ton of emissions. And you don't have a balanced equation. But today, we're really going to focus on these two, baselines and additionality. And so let's sort of get look at how carbon markets work overall, sort of the life cycle of a carbon credit. So we have some emitting entity. It could be an airline, it could be a power generating plant, it could be someone with lots of vehicles. And they maybe made a net zero commitment. And so they're going to purchase some carbon credits to meet their net zero commitment. Those carbon credits are going to fund, for the most part, in many markets, forest carbon projects. And those projects can take the form of afforestation, reforestation, forest regeneration, where someone plants new forests, and those trees pull carbon out of the atmosphere. It can take the form of improved forest management, where people manage their forests so that those forests sequester more carbon. Or it could be in the world of reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. It could be just preventing forests from being cut down in the first place. So we'll pay someone to do one of these activities, and those activities are going to make sure that less carbon ends up in the atmosphere. So I buy a carbon credit, it goes to someone who's going to manage their forests so that those forests emit less or sequester more. Now, the trick here is that they emit less or sequester more than some scenario, right? And how we learn about that scenario is challenging, right? Because someone can say, well, I was going to cut down all of this forest. And maybe they were, maybe they weren't. It's hard for us to tell. But we'll observe how much forest they cut down and compare that to the baseline, which is our estimate of what they would have done. And the difference between how much forest is left and how much they would have had is then the value of those carbon credits. And so that they sell that difference to a company to offset their emissions. And if those offsets equal the residual emissions from that firm, then we'll have net zero. If this works, it's a really great climate solution. And the reason is that for many firms to reduce their own emissions, so to do things like buy electric vehicles or put carbon abatement technology at the top of their smokestack, is really expensive. And in fact, it's much more expensive than paying people to not cut down their forests. And so if you allow people to direct their funding to the cheapest form of carbon abatement, it means that as a whole, we can do much more abatement or sequestration than we would be able to if we make firms pay for their own carbon sequestration. And so the promise here is why we see carbon markets in many forms all over the world. We have carbon markets in the US, carbon markets in China, the voluntary carbon market. But they don't always work the way that they're promised. And so the primary issue is this issue of additionality, which is the credits that projects are selling are more than the actual carbon that they've captured. And that's because it's really hard for us to know what someone would have done. And if you ask someone to tell you what they would have done, they might answer strategically in a way that gets them more carbon credits and more money. And in general, if you're paying someone to conserve, you actually might not care that much what they would have done, as long as they end up conserving some area. But in the world of carbon markets, if the credits sold are more than the carbon captured, and then those carbon credits that don't correspond to real emissions reductions are then used to offset real emissions, then the net effect of a carbon market is more carbon in the atmosphere. And that's bad for all of us. So most of my work in this area is using statistics, and sometimes machine learning, to understand baselines. Remember, baselines are what someone would have done without the carbon project. So to understand how well those baselines work and whether they truly correspond to what someone would have done in a world without the project. And so that issue of not being able to correctly capture what someone would have done in statistics is known as the fundamental problem of causal inference. And that is that for a single project, for a single area, you cannot observe what someone would do without the project and what they would do with the project. You only get to observe one of those. If they implemented the project, you get to observe what they did with the project. If they didn't do a project, you get to observe what they didn't do with the project. Which means that we can never know for sure how many credits to issue. Right? We just have to estimate that quantity. And apologies, I have to put a little bit of math on the slides. But we estimate that with this equation, where we have tau is the effect of some project in carbon credits. And it's for project I in year T. And that effect is the difference between what happened with the project, which is the project, which is the carbon credits in year I, for project I in year T, under the project scenario, and what would have happened without the project. And so this difference between what did happen and what would have happened is our estimate. And so all the protocols out there, of which there are over 30 now, 30 different protocols for estimating what someone would have done or getting a baseline, they all have to borrow information from other sources to estimate what would have been sequestered without the project. Because you can't see what would have happened and what would have not happened, you have to guess at one of those. And the way that you guess is by finding some other group that can give you information about the unobserved scenario. And so I'll now dive into some of our work that's on this topic really directly. So in this paper, we said there are these now about 33 different protocols that you can use if you want to generate carbon credits from forests. We went and read all of them. Each of those protocols is somewhere between 50 and 120 pages. And so we read a lot of protocols. We focused mostly on how they generate baselines, or how they tell you what they think would have happened under no project. And we took all those pages and pages, and we converted all of those into the language of statistics. So we said, this is your baseline. It's your estimate of what would have happened. And we can write that as an equation. And then we said, if that protocol is going to work, if it's going to deliver real carbon credits, what we need is for the estimate of the baseline to correspond to what someone actually would have done. And for that to be true, all of these protocols need some assumptions, because they all learn about this scenario from other places, or from that place in the past, or from some model. But all of those are going to require some assumptions, and in some cases, stronger or weaker assumptions. It's hard to tell what those assumptions are when you read the 15 or 20 pages in the protocol document. But in statistics, when you write it down, then you can really clearly derive what those assumptions are. And so we derive those assumptions, and then we translate those assumptions back into the language of forest carbon credits. And we say, if you're buying credits from this protocol, this is what you are implicitly believing to be true about the world. And if you don't believe the assumptions that are necessary for that protocol to recover what someone would have done, then you shouldn't be buying credits from that protocol. So just to maybe make this a little bit more concrete for you, how many carbon credits should be assigned to this project? So here is an area. This is actually in part of Brazil. And this is a satellite image. And here we have what this project area looked like before the project existed. And so this dark green is mostly forests, but you can see there is a few agricultural fields here, which are places that were deforested. This is what it looked like after the project. So there was some more deforestation down in this area. And the question is, how many credits should we assign to this project? Or how much deforestation did this project prevent? To know the answer to this, we have to know, without the project, would this landscape have looked like this, which is largely deforested, but still some area of forest? Or would it have looked like this, which is almost completely deforested? And so we sort of have to guess at those scenarios. And by the way, it took me a very long time to prompt an AI to make these images turn out the way that I wanted them to. It's still not very good at making nice satellite images. So these different protocols have a few different ways of setting the baseline. We're trying to guess what would have happened. One very common way is what's called a historical average baseline approach. So it says, we'll guess that what you would have done without the project is just what you've done in the past. So we'll take your past carbon stock or your past rate of deforestation, and we'll project that into the future and say, you probably won't change your behavior. And then we'll compare the behavior that you had with the carbon credit to your past behavior. And sometimes this can work, right? But it requires some assumptions to be true, including the assumption that your behavior would not have changed for any other reason. And the assumption that you weren't anticipating joining this project and lowering your rate of deforestation before entering, and then doing more deforestation afterwards. A second approach that's used by many protocols is modeling. And here people just build a model that includes things like, what are the prices of the things that cause deforestation? How far was this area from a lumber mill that causes forests to be cut down for wood and other things. And so here we say, what we project you would have done depends on these things that we can observe, and then we'll compare what you did to that projection. And people have all sorts of ideas about what a good model for this looks like. And then the third approach, which is much newer, but people like this approach more right now, is what's called a matching approach. Some call this a dynamic baselines approach. And here we say, we can't know what you would have done beforehand. Instead, what we'll do is we'll take your project and we'll find some areas nearby that were very similar to your project. And then for some crediting period, maybe 5 years, we'll compare what you did to these nearby places that did not have a carbon project. And the difference between your behavior and those nearby places' behavior is how many credits we'll assign to you. This approach has the problem of not being able to tell people beforehand how many credits you will earn. Because how many credits you earn depends on what your neighbors do. And so instead of taking you through sort of all the statistical translation part of this paper, I'll just give you a few of our main takeaways from this exercise. One is that baselines always require some assumptions, and those assumptions are impossible to verify. Because those assumptions are about the differences between what did happen and what wouldn't happen. And so as a result, we can never truly know how many carbon credits a project or a protocol should produce. But assumptions are necessary for this task. And so at least we should mutually understand and agree upon what those assumptions are, and that those are okay assumptions to be making. Second is that in this world, people use the word additionality to talk about at least 3 different things. One is whether a project would have happened without carbon finance. One is whether some actions under that project would have happened. And one is whether those carbon credits that were generated, whether that carbon would have been sequestered or not. We think that that is really confusing. And so we should just use additionality to talk about the credits. That clarifies things. The third is that part of what causes a big misunderstanding in this world is that for the people who are producing carbon credits, so for the people who have these forest projects, what really matters to them is that they're able to sell some carbon credits. And so they need to be able to say, credits from my project are additional. But the buyers and the people who are trying to understand the net effect of these projects, we really want to understand, are the credits from that protocol additional? So how good is that whole protocol or that whole methodology? And those 2 different things, right, was the project generating carbon credits, or do all the projects under that protocol generate carbon credits? Those require very different kinds of assumptions. In fact, it's almost impossible to say whether the credits from a single project really correspond to emissions reductions, because it's very hard to find an exact twin for that project, or to really know what that project would have done. But at the protocol level, where you have many different projects, you can say, we're okay with getting it a little bit wrong for many of those projects, as long as in some cases we're wrong by underestimating, in some cases we're wrong by overestimating, then eventually we'll sort of get to a middle ground. This is where things sort of really get interesting. And this is that all of these baselines are going to make errors, right? It's so hard to predict what somebody would have done. And you always know better what you would have done than some outside observer. And so there will be errors. And if those errors are predictable, so if you can say, if I enroll in this program, I'm able to generate more carbon credits than if I enrolled in this other program. So if I can predict which program is going to give me more carbon credits, that can destroy additionality. Because projects will always enroll in the protocol that gives them the most carbon credits, or the one that is wrong in their favor. And that means that those protocols are unlikely to correspond to real, complete emissions reductions. And so one solution to that is that dynamic baseline or matching approach, where you don't know what your baseline is going to be until the end of the project. And that makes it so that I can't sort of game the system. I can't see what my baseline would have been, say, oh, that's more than I would have done. I'm going to enroll. But it also makes it so that I won't know how much money I will generate if I take some actions. And that means that it's going to be hard for people to enroll. Okay, let me tell you now about strategic behavior in jurisdictional RED+. So far, we've talked mostly about the things that generate carbon credits being projects. These are like privately owned areas of land, sometimes publicly owned, but usually relatively small. And there's a new-ish type of carbon credit available that come from jurisdictional programs. And so by jurisdictional, I mean sometimes a national government and sometimes a provincial government. So much larger scale. And this type of carbon credit program is motivated by three main issues. The first one is that people argue at the project scale, we can't be sure that forests that are protected by a private company are going to stay protected very long in the future. Because if that company is sold, if they go bankrupt, maybe they'll just allow that forest to be cut down shortly afterwards. And perhaps governments, with their policies, can provide a more stable protection for forests. The second, and maybe best argument, is leakage. And so leakage, remember, is when if I pay you not to cut down your forest, but there's still demand for wood, maybe your neighbors are going to cut down their forests instead. And so by paying you to not cut down your forest, all I've done is displaced deforestation. The proponents of jurisdictional RED say that most leakage, or most of that spillover, happens with your immediate neighbors. And if the whole jurisdiction is reducing its rate of deforestation, so I pay everyone in this room, then you can't just have more deforestation in your neighbor. That deforestation has to be displaced much, much farther away, often across a border. And that makes it harder for the firms that are causing deforestation because they have to change their whole supply chain. Maybe they have to deal with different laws and regulations, different import issues. And so making deforestation cross borders has the potential to reduce leakage. And third is double counting. It's easier, basically, to get governments to keep track of these things than private companies. But our area of focus in this paper, which just came out last week, by the way, is how good are the baselines that are used in jurisdictional law. And so let me tell you about, well, a little bit more about how these jurisdictional RED credits are increasingly popular, sort of what the financial landscape looks like. They have over $4 billion in commitments so far, including $1.5 billion from the LEAF Coalition which includes companies like Microsoft, Tencent, Amazon, so the huge companies. Firms have committed to $750 million from Guyana, $93 million from Ghana, and $2 billion from token fields. And so there are massive, massive financial commitments to this new type of credit, especially after you saw the big reduction in sales in the voluntary carbon market. So people have decided maybe this is a safer way to go. But so far, there's not very much work on how credible or additional these carbon credits are. And so in this project, we test the baselines that are used by these jurisdictional projects. And these baselines, I'll show you this in just a minute, but the way that these baselines work is they say the 5 years prior to the start of a jurisdictional program, we'll take the average deforestation in those 5 years. And then for the 5 years that you're enrolled in the program, we'll compare your deforestation to the previous 5-year average. So all you have to do to get carbon credits is reduce your rate of deforestation compared to what it was before. It's a really transparent way to do things. So we're going to check to see how well this works and whether it's possible to take advantage of this system. Maybe some of you are thinking, I know how I would take advantage of the system. So for every jurisdiction and year that some jurisdiction is not enrolled in the program, so these are all the places that are not in the program, we're going to calculate their baseline. And remember, a baseline is what someone would have done if they weren't in the program. So if we do this, we can verify how well these baselines work, right? We're trying to estimate what they would do without carbon credits for all the places that didn't generate any carbon credits. And so we're estimating something that we directly observe, and we can see how good our estimate was. And we're going to compare that baseline to the behavior of these actual jurisdictions and see how often does this baseline overestimate deforestation, how often does it underestimate deforestation, when does it get it right. And this is going to tell us how well baselines work for these eligible but unenrolled jurisdictions. And that we can then use to infer how well these baselines are probably working for the jurisdictions that are enrolled. So let me sort of give you a clearer picture of what these baselines look like. Here we have Piauí in Brazil. This is the annual rate of deforestation. So more deforestation, this is in hectares. And then down here we have the year. And so Piauí has not ever enrolled in jurisdictional red. So this is their rate of deforestation. And let's imagine that they enrolled in the year 2012. If they did that, their baseline is going to be their average rate of deforestation in the 5 prior years. And we'd compare that to their actual rate of deforestation over the next 5 years. And so here, Piauí, their deforestation was higher than their baseline, so they would not have generated any credits to be able to sell. Do you think this is a fair comparison, right? Does this baseline capture what they actually did without any carbon credits? It's wrong here, right? It's the baseline is underestimated. And you might think, actually, you know what would be a better baseline is if instead of taking the average, you sort of made a best fit line through here. And so this is a little bit different assumption. This is saying that these trends in deforestation are persistent. Those trends are likely to continue. So let me show you a couple of places. One is Piaui and one is Boquerón. And here, for Boquerón, their rate of deforestation was decreasing. So their baseline was above what their actual deforestation was. Now, Boquerón did not enroll in jurisdictional red. But if they had enrolled in this year and done exactly nothing, they would have generated some carbon credits because their deforestation was lower than their baseline. Now let's go back and look at Piaui again. Right? This is, imagine they enrolled but did nothing. They actually would have had to work hard before they got to a level where they could have generated any carbon credits. So if you're in charge of Boquerón, does it make sense for you to enroll? Yeah, you can get some credits for doing nothing, right? So your government will get paid, you can use that money maybe to do more public services. That sounds great. Problem is that those credits don't correspond to any changes that you made because of the program. So if someone buys those credits and uses them to offset emissions, that's bad for the atmosphere, bad for climate change. If you're in charge of Piaui, are you going to enroll? Probably not, right? You have to do a lot of work before you even get to a point where you can generate any carbon credits. And this is bad, because which place needs to enroll? Which place would we like to enroll? Is the place where deforestation is going up, right? This is the place where we really want to direct conservation finance. And so this is sort of an unintended consequence of the way that baselines are constructed in these programs. You might think, instead, maybe it's not the trend, right? Maybe it's not things are trending upward or trending downward, but it's that the level is persistent. But instead, we'll just use like the last year in the baseline as the new baseline, right? So the trend sometimes predicts whether you can generate fake carbon credits, but the last year of deforestation before the start of the crediting period is often a better predictor of deforestation than this 5-year average. And so we hear about this for Salta and for Belarus. And once again, we can see, like, if you're in Salta and you know, my last year was much lower than my baseline, I should probably enroll, right? I'll get some carbon credits for doing nothing. But if you're in Belarus and the year is 2017, you're probably not going to enroll because you know you have a lot of work to do before you can get to even 0 credits. And so this gives us 2 possible, very simple decision rules that you can use to game this system. One is you could base your enrollment decision on your trend. So if your rate of deforestation is decreasing, enroll, you might get some extra credits. Or you could base your enrollment decision based on your most recent year. You could say, if my most recent year had lower deforestation than my average, maybe I'll enroll. But if it had higher than my average, I won't enroll. I will note that this protocol, jurisdictional red protocol, there are 2 of them, that they both have safeguards that are designed to make it so that if you do enroll in these programs, you can't just sit back and do nothing. You actually have to make some policy changes. But when I've gone and tried to read all the policy changes that these jurisdictions are making, it's really hard to tell which of those changes are because they enrolled and which of them are things that they already had going on. And most worrying to me is whether this is deterring the places that need carbon finance the most from enrolling. So this safeguards thing works for preventing people from cheating the system. But even if these worked, this wouldn't solve the problem of the places where deforestation is increasing, the places most at risk, not being able to enroll and get credit for changes that they make. So when we do tests and see whether it would be possible for jurisdictions to strategically enroll and get credits for doing nothing, what we find is that many jurisdictions could make millions of dollars by doing nothing if they just use these decision rules. However, we have about 20 jurisdictions that have enrolled in jurisdictional Red Plus. So we can test, did they enroll because their trend was going down or because they had this last year difference? And we can compare, like, does this cause some jurisdictions to enroll and others to not enroll? Or does this make it so that if you're just looking at one jurisdiction, do they enroll in the year where their trend is most pointed downward or where they have the biggest drop? We don't find any evidence that jurisdictions are enrolling based on these heuristics. And very little to no evidence that they're choosing the start date of enrollment based on these decision rules. So even though there is potential for this to happen, it doesn't seem like it's happening, at least so far. I have a lot of theories about why this is the case. And this is why I'm now going and reading all these policies that jurisdictions are trying to pass. However, in this work, we find a different sort of concerning other response to enrollment in jurisdictional red. And that is anticipatory behavior. So in other environmental policy areas, we find that when there's a new regulation on fishing that's going to come into effect, often just before that regulation happens, people who will be affected by the regulation really increase their rates of fishing just before the regulation starts. And so we think that depending on a jurisdiction's anti-deforestation plan, depending on how they plan to reduce deforestation, this is what we might see. So here we have this jurisdiction. This is their the reference period, those 5 years before the enrollment. And what we see in many cases is actually that just before the enrollment, we'll see a large increase in deforestation. And this means that likely what's happening in these jurisdictions is some landowners are noticing that they're going to face stricter deforestation regulations. And so as a result, they say, okay, if we want to clear land, we have to clear it now. And so that means more deforestation in the reference period. And that means that your baseline gets a little bit higher. And so you get credited for more, so more false credits. And then the deforestation that would have happened later gets pulled earlier. And that's also bad, right? If we can, we'd like to reduce our emissions until much farther in the future. We don't think that this is actually the government's trying to take advantage of this. We think this is mostly private actors. And we see this in many places, right? So these are all the jurisdictions where we see an increase in deforestation just prior to the start of enrollment. But we don't see it everywhere. And in some places, we actually see reduced deforestation prior to enrollment. And so the other reason that we're trying to figure out the policies of all of these jurisdictions is we think that in places where their plan for reducing deforestation include fines and regulations, that people will do their deforestation a little bit earlier. But in other places where their main plan for reducing deforestation is to pay people who are conserving their forest, in those places, it doesn't make sense for me to cut down my forest before it starts, because then I won't have any forest to get paid to preserve. So in those places, we might actually see a reduction in deforestation during the reference period. So a couple of takeaways from this study is that there are truly, I think, many benefits to jurisdictional approaches. But setting good baselines for jurisdictions is really hard, maybe harder than the private scheme. And they present new challenges like private actors anticipating policies and changing their behavior in a way that damages the credibility of the credits. On the other hand, we note that governments seem to not be taking advantage of some pretty obvious ways that they could game the system and generate credits by doing nothing. And the reason for that is that governments have to act differently than the private companies that manage most carbon projects. If you're a private company managing a carbon project, you can choose things like, when is it best for me to enroll? Should I enroll this area or this area? But if you're a policymaker in a government, the most binding constraints on your actions are things like, do I have an election coming up? Right? How is this going to change my support? How does this interact with other existing regulations? And so governments are much more constrained in how they're able to take advantage of these things. And we think that makes it so that even though there are these ways where they could try to cheat the system, they're not doing so. So this paper is called Evaluating the Impact of Forest-Based Carbon Offset Projects Using Machine Learning. And here, we're examining a different type of carbon market. So far we've mostly been talking about the voluntary carbon market, where firms have made net zero commitments, and they're trying to meet those commitments. But there aren't any rules that say you have to be net zero or you have to offset your emissions. This paper instead focuses on compliance markets, which are places where governments have said, this firm is only allowed to emit this much carbon. And if they emit more than that, they have to either pay a fine or they have to buy some carbon credits, pay someone else to reduce their emissions. This is often called a cap and trade program, where a government will cap their total emissions and then allow companies to trade emissions reductions with under that cap. So that way they're able to reduce total emissions, but companies still have some flexibility about what strategies they want to take. And so these compliance markets include China's emissions trading scheme, which is actually undergoing some really interesting changes now, quite recently. The European Union has an emissions trading scheme that's been going on for some time. And we'll focus on the California cap and trade market. But I think China's ETS is actually the largest compliance market in the world right now. And I've mostly been focusing on forest-based carbon credits. And I think that China's emissions trading scheme mostly does not allow carbon offsets from forest carbon credits, except for a very small proportion. I think right now 5% of a firm's emissions can be offset from these nature-based projects. And I'm still learning about the Chinese market. But firms that exceed their emissions allowances have to offset their emissions. So in California, we're on period 5 of this emissions trading scheme. But here I'm showing the sources of carbon credits. So at first there were not very many, but most of the carbon credits in green here come from forestry-based projects in the US. So these are places where people are conserving their forest or they're managing their forest to reduce emissions and increase carbon sequestration. Actually, most of those come from a project type called improved forest management. So these are places where the forest is being managed, it's not being preserved, which means that some of the forest is being cut down, replanted, cut down, replanted. A few of the credits come from avoided conversion, which is preventing a forest from being cut down overall. But most of the credits come from this improved forest management, where people who are harvesting wood, cutting down forests, are doing so in a way that is emitting less carbon than they would have done. So often this takes the form of, instead of taking a forest and clear cutting it, cutting all the trees down, it means that you do some selective clearing. So you cut down some trees here, some over there, but you leave some trees standing to encourage faster forest regrowth. Or maybe you wait a little bit longer before you harvest the trees so they can get bigger, sequester more carbon. Now, in this California market, there are really two sources of carbon credits. I'm showing you the share of the total credits that are issued here on the y-axis. On the x-axis, you have the year since the start of the project. And so here, most of the credits, right, about 70% of those credits come from the first 2 years of a project. So you might wonder, like, how can you possibly manage your forest to reduce emissions in the first 2 years? Right? There's like not that much that you can do that quickly. And so it turns out that actually all of these credits in the first 2 years are because of the way that the protocol is written, so that you can be credited for the difference between your project and the regional average of biomass. So if you put a project in a place where the trees are just bigger and older, you can claim credit for that difference. And so we've been talking about issues with baselines, right? This is perhaps an obvious one to you now, that people will go and buy that land and start harvesting carbon credits from that place, even if they were never planning on cutting it down, never planning on managing it. These credits, we think, are not very good. We can zoom in. Right? So here I'm showing you, on this side, is the above ground biomass density from these projects. This is like how much carbon is in each hectare of forest. And here we have years before the start of a project, and then after the project begins. And in green, we have the project areas. And in red, we have places that were just outside of the project areas. Right? So nearby places that are likely pretty similar. And in blue is the carbon credits that are generated by those projects. So like the difference between the project area and the nearby areas is about that much. But they're claiming that many credits from initial differences. That seems not so good. And then if you look at these trends, right, in the project area and outside the project area, you can see actually that they are diverging a little bit. And if you look over here, you can see the divergence a little bit more. That means those projects, they are doing something. But this is how many credits they're claiming in those years. So are those projects doing as much as the credits they're claiming? Maybe not. Is this a fair comparison? Right? Is this a good way to assign baselines? Well, maybe, but actually probably not. Because those projects are put in those places for particular reasons. And so comparing them just to their neighbors is maybe not a very good comparison. And so here's where we'll try to do something that is a lot better, but also a lot more complicated. So here I have a project on the east coast of the US. The project is in the green area. The neighbors are in this white band around it. And we'll go, and for every little piece of land here, we're going to use remote sensing, satellite imagery, to look at what the land use was in that spot. So is it forest, water, wetland, maybe it was developed, grassland. And so inside the project is pretty much all forest. But outside the project, we have these developed areas, we have some barren land. And so it doesn't make sense for us to compare inside the project to all of these outside areas. In fact, what we should be doing is finding the areas that are nearby that are very similar to the areas inside the project. And so we'll do that with a machine learning method. We'll take all the satellite images, we're going to process those with some machine learning tools, and we're going to find the places that are most similar. And that's going to give us this map down here, which is a map of the similarity to each place to all the other areas inside. And then we'll use those as comparisons. But we won't just compare those to the outside areas. We'll also use our satellite images and machine learning to try to predict how much deforestation is going to happen there 10 years in the future. And so we sort of have two ways of capturing the effect of the project. One is saying, how much deforestation do we think is going to happen? And then did it happen? And if there's less deforestation than we predicted, maybe it reduced deforestation. And then we'll also try to do that comparison only on the very similar places. So that sort of double approach is going to make it so that we think that the baselines that we get from this machine learning approach are going to be very credible. And we do some tests that are sort of like the previous paper, where we test how well those baselines correspond to what people actually did in areas that did not enroll in carbon projects. And it seems like they work pretty well. So if we use that approach and look at how well, when we calculate how much carbon was sequestered by a project, and compare that to how many credits that project sold, what do we find? And so on average, across all of these projects, we're going to use two different statistical approaches to estimate this. And ours is this green one. Another pretty good one we think is this pink one. So here we have years to the first offset issuance, so the start of the project. So 0 right here is the beginning of the project. Blue is how many carbon credits the project issued. And pink and green are what we think our estimate of how much carbon was actually sequestered. And here we've gotten rid of those that first year because we think those are sort of just ridiculous. It'll make this look terrible if we include them. And so here we find the actual changes that those projects are making maybe generate about half or a little less than half of the credits that are being sold by those projects. So you might think that's really bad. But this is actually a much more hopeful estimate than many of the previous papers have found. Some of those papers find that only about 5% of the credits that are being sold by projects are additional. And so when we find about 40%, this is much, much better, although still not close to what we'd like it to be. On the other hand, actually some projects do exactly what they say they were going to. And so within the California market, there's this program called Direct Environmental Benefit to the State of California. And it's this extra thing that you have to sign up for and provide a lot of documentation. And when I go and read the applications that people submit to say we're providing a direct environmental benefit to the state of California, mostly what they show is that they're reducing deforestation in some river area, and that river flows down to the state of California. Now it turns out that when they apply for that successfully, the credits that they issue are almost exactly how much carbon they conserved. But the places that don't have this seem to be doing pretty close to nothing. And so we're curious about why this is happening, right? Maybe it's just the places, maybe it's just the people who have a lot of capacity where they think maybe we should enroll in this direct environmental benefit, that they're the ones that are actually making the changes, right? They care about other environmental benefits. But this is not all negative about the California carbon market. So we know how many credits these projects should have produced. And we know their approximate sales prices. We can look at what the average rate of buying a carbon credit is. And we can say, if the protocol generated the credits according to our method, we can see what the price would have to be for those companies to keep the same profit margin. So we said, you sold 100 credits, you should have sold 40. What would the price of those 40 credits have to be for you to still be willing to make the same conservation changes? And we can compare that to estimates of the social cost of carbon. So how damaging emitting a ton of carbon is to society. And this is what we find. So here we have the number of projects in dark green, and in this shaded area, we have the total credits issued. Here we have a social cost of carbon of $50 per ton, which is what it was in 2021 in the US. And then it was updated to $190 a ton. Has since been downgraded. But we find that actually a lot of these projects and credits would still be willing to sequester carbon at a price that's less than what we think the cost is to society of emitting carbon. So there are a lot of those projects that are still feasible, even if we assign them credits in a way that's a little bit more appropriate. So a couple of takeaways here. One is that if you make a system easy to game, people are going to game the system. That's what we see happening with the first year credits. We find that actual changes are still overcredited. Right? People who are managing their forests differently are still being assigned too many carbon credits. But there is a lot of heterogeneity. In some places, the projects are doing really well, and in some places, they're not doing very well. The places that successfully applied for this DEBS certification are doing really well, for example. But with correct crediting, many of these projects are still feasible. But our approach that we used in this paper is actually really similar to this dynamic baselines or matching approach. And so if that were used, then these firms who are generating carbon credits, they would not know how many credits they generated until the end of the project. And that's going to make it really challenging for them to decide whether or not to enroll. So I'll wrap up and give you a few minutes for questions. But overall conclusions are that carbon markets can be an effective climate solution. They have that possibility. But there's still a lot of work that needs to be done on the way that we calculate baselines and the way that we understand additionality. And really importantly, the more resistant the baseline is to gaming, the riskier it is for people to enroll, because they don't know how many carbon credits they're going to achieve. So we're working on how can we design transparent but also robust baseline methodologies. How can we make it possible for firms to enroll while also try to prevent overcrediting? Jurisdictional red is a promising direction, but the baselines that they use are not very robust. And we have to learn more about what's going on with this anticipatory deforestation that we see in many jurisdictions. And finally, machine learning can help us with determining additionality. We compare this to other approaches, this using remote sensing data and trying to find similar places, trying to project. It really helps estimate how well these projects are working. And we find that even using that approach, many of these projects and credits are still viable. With that, I'll wrap up and ask for questions. So, thank you.